Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. It's good to see people starting to come in. I have some exciting news, especially for some of you. Let me put this up here and let you know what's going on. We're allowed to put together extra tours, extra speaking, and even speaking, getting together with people for coffee, visiting churches, even when we're not speaking, house meetings, and a host of other things at Chosen People because of COVID. So if you are in the Indiana or Pennsylvania areas, which are two areas that I'm looking at, please let me know. I'm going to put back my number. See, that is actually a personal number. That might be a little dangerous to do on YouTube, but I really want to open that up to the community, or an email. It is quite possible that I will be able to go ahead and arrange something. So I'm just putting that out there. We have churches in the Pennsylvania area, at least one. And of course, my daughter and son-in-law live in the Indiana area. So that's a real possibility for us to visit some churches, have coffee with some pastors, do some house meetings, and meet new people. And so I'm excited about that possibility. And so I wanted to throw that out there. And if anyone else sees this, that information's there, and it's a real opportunity this year post-COVID. So, shalom to Chris, who has entered the room. And we're going to get started looking at Gethsemane. As always, I've got the PowerPoint and the Logos Bible software up, and we are good to go. Why did I name this what I named this? I named this this way because we're going to look at the struggle in the Garden of Gethsemane and what it teaches us. Now, before I do that, you will notice a new overlay. That is courtesy of Mr. Phil Fox, who was on last night and who has his own station, and he sent me a new overlay as a gift. So that's what you're seeing. So shout out to Mr. Phil Fox for being better at graphics than I am. We're going to get the chance to talk about the nature or natures of Jesus and how they play out in the Garden of Gethsemane. So let me go back there and pop that up again. Go back here and pop this up. Okay. Now, I'm going to go to the passage first because you're going to need some context here as to what's going on. What we're looking at here is the end of what I believe to be a Passover Seder. Slam says, is Northwest Indiana a possibility? I'm just going to say yes. Get in touch with me. Yes, it definitely is a possibility. I'm thinking of Northwest, the area, and my father is also in the Chicago area. So that would be a definite possibility. So that would be cool. There's some discussion around this, but let's just leave that for now because what we do know is what they do afterwards. They went out singing a hymn. Now, you might be wondering what they were singing. I mean, was it Amazing Grace? What was the hymn? And I'm being a little facetious here because no one really thinks about what they were singing. I think we have a real clue to what they were singing, particularly if this was a Passover Seder. It is traditional to sing the hymns that are known as the Hallel Psalms. Now, the word Hallel has the idea of praise, which are Psalms 115 through 118. Now, what is exciting to me about that is if they were indeed singing those psalms, and we have reasons to believe that they were singing psalms that have a lot of messianic references while they were walking with Jesus to the garden. So they were singing about Jesus while they were walking with Jesus. What is really interesting about that is that when I do a Christ in the Passover, a Messiah in the Passover, I point this out. Really, they are getting messianic prophecy ringing in their ears before they get to the garden. But let me give you a real insight into the Garden of Gethsemane, and some of you are really going to appreciate this. It is not an accident that Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, I had the honor of being there. I really can't show you a picture. In those days, I took physical pictures that could be turned into slides, and I've not yet learned to digitize those, and that would be a real work. If they're physical pictures, I'd have to dig through them and see if I got one. But I remember being up there, and the Garden of Gethsemane looks over the Kidron Valley that looks into Jerusalem and the Eastern Gate, as I recall. And what's really interesting about the Garden of Gethsemane is that there are olive trees that are roughly 2,000 years old. So I was looking at olive trees that Jesus himself might have actually seen and might have been there. That was really awesome to me. Now, what was the Garden of Gethsemane used for, and what is it named after? Well, the meaning of the Garden of Gethsemane is olive presses. Isn't that kind of interesting that a garden would be named olive presses? And olive trees are incredibly sturdy. And what this was used for was to press olive oil. But what was the olive oil used for? Well, tradition has it that the olive oil from Gethsemane that was pressed out in those olive presses was used in the temple. Now, why do I find that particularly interesting? Well, I find it particularly interesting because this is the garden that we're going to see Jesus pressed out, in a sense, before he becomes the sacrifice, is the same garden that the olive oil was pressed out that was used in the temple. And so that is a really interesting insight to me, because those are parts of the pattern that would speak to somebody like Matthew very strongly. Those are those sorts of hints, those motif things that are really neat. And so I just wanted to point that out as kind of a Hebrew roots, Hebrew mindset, Jewish mindset, Second Temple mindset that would speak to that audience, particularly the Jewish part of that audience, like a Matthew's audience, deeply. Now, we are going to go ahead and look at the rest, continue. Matthew deliberately indicates the disciples' abandonment of Jesus is fulfilling prophecy. So let's see how Matthew does this and what Matthew is pointing to. After they had sang the hymn, Jesus says to them something incredibly shocking. Now, you have to imagine these guys. They're not even ready for what's coming. They are expecting the kingdom. Jesus, after the singing of the hymn, then they go on the Mount of Olives. Okay, and again, that was a place of olive trees. He says, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night, for it is written. Now he's going to quote Old Testament scripture here. Strike the sheep, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I've been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. So let's take a look at what's going on here. Now, this is an interesting use of prophecy. And so we need to ask ourselves, what is Jesus doing with this prophecy? The way New Testament writers use prophecy is terribly important, and the way Jesus uses prophecy is terribly important. So I'm looking at the context in which this prophecy is derived. Okay, this is a prophecy out of Zechariah. Now, we're talking about Zechariah 12. Okay, And let's look at the way Zechariah 12 is set up. So what you're seeing is 1 through 9 deals with the nations attacking Jerusalem and Judea. But they're defeated. See verse 2 below. But, we're not really going to jump there. In 12:10 through 14, the people who have pierced the Lord's representative, the house of David, and its inhabitants of Jerusalem will mourn and grieve for him. Okay, now let me take you there and show you what's going on. So I'm going to go to 14 of Zechariah. Okay. And I'm going to go a little bit before here. Okay, I'm going to go up to 12. Okay. And we can see what's going on here. In that day, there'll be great mourning, 11, like the mourning at Hadad Ramon in the plain of Megiddo, and the land shall mourn, every family by itself, the family of the house of David by itself, the wives by themselves, the house of Nathan, one of David's sons, by itself, and their wives by themselves, just displaying this. The family of the house of Levi by itself, and their wives by themselves. Now, what that does is that takes in not only Judah, David's household, but the family of Levi, and then particularly one particular reference is named by itself and its wives. All the families that remain, every family by itself and their wives by themselves. Now, in that day starts 13. And whenever you see in that day, we're talking about future eschatological times. Okay? By Yom HaHu is the phrase in Hebrew. There shall be opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and uncleanness a fountain. So we're talking about cleansing from sin here. In that day, the Lord of hosts shall cut off the names of the idols from the land, and they shall no longer be remembered. And I will cause the prophets and the unclean spirit to depart from the land. There's going to be a purification of the land and its people, and it shall come that to pass that if anyone prophesies, then his father and mother who begat him will say, you shall not live because you've spoken lies in the name of the Lord. Now, the idea here is false prophets, okay? And thrust him through when he prophesies. In other words, there'll be no toleration for idolatry or false prophets in those days. Okay? It shall be that in that day every prophet shall be ashamed of his vision, that which he prophesies, and he will not wear the robes of coarse hair to deceive. There's going to be no more false spirituality here is the idea. He will say, I am no prophet, I am a farmer, for a man taught me to keep cattle from my youth. There's going to be a disavowing of any sort of pretense of false prophecy here. Okay? Now we get to 7. Now let me go back to the slide, okay? And that day false prophecy will be removed. The Lord's shepherd will be struck, and the sheep will scatter. There is a severe purifying, and the covenant promises are renewed. So that's the flow of the text there. Now, Jesus is using the section here that has to do with strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. Well, where do we see that? Awake, O sword, against my shepherd and against the man who is my companion, says the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. Then I will turn my hands against the little one, and it shall come to pass in the land, says the Lord, that 2/3 will be cut off and die, and 1/3 will be left in it. So there's going to be a purification. Now, this verse in particular is in reference to what I believe is the tribulation, in which there is a purging of Israel. So does Israel corporately get saved? Yes. But then people complain and they say, well, does that mean every Jewish person gets saved? No, because there's going to be a purging going on. Now, it's within this context that Jesus is going ahead and pulling that verse out. And so the outline given is by G. Michael Butterworth in the New Bible Commentary. And you can see that the Lord shepherd is struck and the sheep scatter, and there is a severe purifying. Now, then you say, okay, how is Jesus using this? because obviously this is eschatological beyond his day to the eventual setting up of realization of the kingdom, because there's a main point. Now, we've talked about sensus plenior. The prophet is seeing the eschatological picture, but there's a binding element that Jesus is using in order to do pesher, this is that sort of thing. And sometimes that this is that is pesher. Sometimes it's called pesher, okay? What's the same here is the striking of the shepherd and the scattering of the sheep. That common element he's using. And so he's saying the common element or motif is being fulfilled in me ultimately, but will have some sort of realization later on. And he can do that because of sensus plenior. Zechariah is thinking about a certain eschatological event, but there are things that Zechariah doesn't see that are extensions of the meaning that he's conveying. And I don't want to get too deep in that, but what I want to say is that the use that Jesus is giving this is to emphasize himself as the shepherd and the scattering of the sheep, which are his disciples. Now, there'll be other sheep included, but the disciples are central to his plan. And so that's what we're looking at here when we look at Jesus's use. Is this a legitimate use? Yes, it's a legitimate use. It's one of the ways that Old Testament prophecy is used. I'm not going to go through those 4 ways tonight. We've hit them before. It would have been a good place to review them, but we've gone over them a lot of times before, and you can see past videos that touch upon how prophecy was used, and it's several different ways that it could be used that were totally acceptable to the venue, to the Second Temple period. And so he's pulling this common element. And this is where I talked about sensus plenior. What we do is we look for the key element. What is the prophet saying at that point? What's the authorial intent? And then what's the common element to the divine extension of that prophecy in ways that the prophet didn't really know? So it always means what it means. It can mean more, but it can't mean less, and it can't mean something different. And if you memorize anything else, remember that with the extended meaning of prophecy. It can mean more, but it can't mean less, and it can't mean something different. That common element has to be there, and it has to firmly anchor the extended meaning or the fuller meaning, which is what sensus plenior means, and the original meaning. Now, that's just some background. We've got a lot of interesting stuff to cover tonight, okay? The purification in Zechariah's case is a little different. But the disciples represent the new community. That's why I use the term kochel. And they're at the core of the establishment of the new covenant. And so just as there'll be a scattering and purification for Israel to return in right relationship with God, so too there'll be a scattering as Israel essentially rejects her rightful king. But here's the thing that's even more incredible. This is really incredible. Okay. There's a constant contrast between Moses and Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. And my friend, Professor Rabinowitz, could wax eloquent on this, having done his doctoral dissertation on this. Okay? And so what we're seeing here is Jesus is going on a mount and giving information to his disciples again to prepare them in terms of the extending of the new kochel during the present age we're in, starting with them and continuing from there. And so he is again training his disciples, the 12, just like the 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples, really 12. Judas is left. Judas didn't go. Judas is going to be returning, but Judas is gone. So at this point, even more so, the 12. Jesus is the bringer of the new covenant, and this motif is continually being used. I want you to understand a thought that's not in my PowerPoint, but think about it. Spend some time with it. Let the Lord show you this beauty. Covenants are associated with mountains. Okay, I mean, even the upper room, okay, which is in Jerusalem, is elevated. It's 2,000 feet up, 4,000 feet from the Dead Sea. You go up to Jerusalem. Covenants are associated. The Noahic covenant is established on Ararat. The Abrahamic covenant is reiterated and really sort of reiterated, strengthened on Mount Moriah. Because you have done this. The Mosaic covenant is given on Sinai. The new covenant is inaugurated on Zion. And so we see this continual pattern. Now, why would God do that? There are several reasons that God would do that. Michael Heisner would say that the gods were always associated with the mountaintops because they're elevated, they're high up. Well, okay, maybe not. It is an interesting sort of motif that occurs with, but mountains are enduring. They're signs. They're visible symbols. Just as the mountains are enduring, so too the covenants that God makes endure. And God's faithfulness is pictured in the enduringness of the mountains, and the covenants enduringness is pictured in the mountains. And so that's kind of where that is coming from. And so that's just a little addition here. No, I'm not really far off course because remember, we're talking about Mount Gethsemane. Gethsemane is up high. Okay, not, I'm not going to debate elevation here, but when I was in the Mount, in Gethsemane, I looked down into the Kidron Valley. And I looked over and then up again was Jerusalem. And, when I looked down at Jerusalem, which is elevated, it did not seem as elevated as the Mount of Olives did. And so there are these motifs that are going on. And so check it out. Match your mountains to the covenant. See if generally this does not tend to be the case. Okay? Not only is this amplified by the mountain and the Kochel and the 12, but remember that in the what I believe to be a Seder, Jesus says, this is the new covenant in my blood. And so the context of this immediately before is a new covenant context. It's a context that mentions and pictures the new covenant. And I think that just further amplifies the point. Now we get to Peter's failure. What happens with Peter? Well, Peter is good when he's very good, and he's problematic when he's problematic. Now, Peter's response to Jesus' stating that he was going to go ahead and be betrayed was not me. And of course, Jesus says, no, not so, Peter. Before the cock crows 3 times, you will deny me 3. Before the rooster crows, you will have denied me 3 times. And this comes to pass. Of course, Peter denies it. And then all his disciples do too. Oh, well, I wouldn't do that. They're not going to let Peter get away with saying this and not them. Well, I'm just as loyal. It's not going to happen with me, Lord. And we're looking exegetically at this. So we need to see it in its context, okay? He makes some really rash statements. Peter is an impulsive personality. If I was going to talk about 4 personalities, I don't have a problem with there being types of people. Peter would be in the realm of what's called the choleric personality, okay? To use old language, he would be just that kind of person. He's rash. He wants to get things done. He doesn't always think about stuff real carefully. He's the driver. Okay. I mean, his personality just has drive. Okay. And he'll be restored, but he's going to need to take a bit of a fall because Peter overestimates his own ability in the flesh. And so that's a real kind of problem. And he becomes a key player in the Jerusalem church. In fact, what you see in Acts is Peter starts out being the prominent person, and James comes in here, and then what you see is the prominent person becomes Paul as the mission moves out of Jerusalem and towards the center of the political world, which is Rome. But that is another story. They were asked to keep vigil. What do I mean by keep vigil? They were asked not to fall asleep. Okay, Jesus comes to the place called Gethsemane. They've been walking. It's a walk. Okay, we did that walk. And it's a walk. I can see why these guys were like somewhat athletically fit here because they were doing their regular cardio here, going from place to place. And he says to sit, and he is going to pray. Now, we're entering into the battle zone here. This is where we're going to start really talking here. Jesus knows what's coming next is going to be intense, and he is going to experience the full realization of what he's going to go through. Now, I don't think he didn't know, but it's coming up. You know how when you're anticipating something and it's coming up, it's like really on your mind. I have real problems with that because my mind used to keep working when I sleep, and I had trouble disengaging it. This is like seriously coming up. This is on the horizon, and the full weight of this is beginning to fall on Jesus. And so he takes the two sons of Zebedee, and he says, "Go sit here, and I will pray over there." So Jesus's response to the incredible weight that he's going to feel in relationship to what he's going to go through, in relationship to spiritual battle, is to get alone with God. And I think that's a real take home right there. Okay. If you've got something big coming up, or you've got some real spiritual warfare coming up, you need to take to going to God and discussing it with him. Now he states, see, you could see what's going on here. My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. This is really weighing on him. So he goes to the garden and he addresses the situation, which is feeling the full weight. And what's happening here now is Jesus is entering into spiritual battle. He knows what's coming, and he does not want to go through with it. Now, he does in one sense, but the horror of it is overwhelming here. And so he takes his request to the Father. If possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. The request here is the horror of the cross is really producing a problem in him. We're going to talk about his two natures. What nature is responding here? What do I mean by he has two natures? In what way was Jesus tempted? But he's appealing to the Father. This is an honest to goodness appeal. This is important. When he came back to the disciples, he found them asleep. Now, I'm a little nicer to the disciples because I know that during a meal like this, grape juice is used and it's sometimes slightly fermented. And remember that they've done at least 4 cups of this. But the idea was they were supposed to be vigilant. Now, Jesus is concerned, even at this point, for the spiritual warfare that's also going to spread to the disciples. Don't think Satan's going to stop with Jesus. Okay, he wants to get rid of Jesus, but he certainly is not going to leave them alone. Watch and pray lest you enter to temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Now, I'm not going to talk about the nuances of this. I do want to let you know that these are imperatives. Let me do this here. Okay, I'm going to actually go to this. Hopefully you can see it, but it should state present active imperative. So watch and pray are not suggestions. Now, in the case of pray, it's proskuneo, but it's different. It's a passive. It means could be understood as a middle. You yourselves pray. I don't see it as being a passive, something being done to them, because watch and let someone pray for you doesn't seem to be the idea, lest you enter into temptation. Now he asks God the same thing again. If this cup pass from me, cannot pass from me until I drink it, your will be done. This is the real battle here of the wills. So let's talk about what's going on here. Okay. It's a lonely hour. He's spending it with the disciples. He asked them to pray. Now, what would Jesus do? Jesus is God. What does Jesus need strengthening for? And don't think Muslims don't bring this up. How can you say Jesus is God if he's praying to God? How could you say Jesus is God if he's asking God to help him or to take something from him? If he was God, he could do all things. What is going on here? Okay. We have to remember something very important. This is where we get into what's called the hypostatic union. Jesus had a human nature. What Jesus is facing here in terms of the cross is very real as far as his human nature. He knows he can experience all the dread and pain that the crucifixion would bring. He is looking at something absolutely horrible. I hate, despise when they use torture in movies. That bothers me. Torture as a whole bothers me. I consider it barbaric and irrational. Okay? I hate that sort of thing. In battle, if you have to, I'm not talking about the rightness or wrongness skill. Look, if you have to kill, you just get her done. Okay? He knows what's coming. Crucifixion was horrible. So in his human nature, he experienced the desire to avoid this on a very human level. There is no temptation that has come to you except that God is able to hear it. And God understands from a human level temptation. In fact, it's very important that we understand this human level and this battle. Okay, now the hypostatic union is real important to doctrine. We're going to see why it's important to doctrine, but understand what we're talking about here. And there's a way to explain this to Muslims. And there's a way to explain this to Jews. But it's going to require some translation. And unfortunately, because the church's councils at this point in history do not include a strong representation of a Jewish believing remnant in the church, Greek terminology is exclusively used. There are some people working on finding a Hebraic expression for the same thing. All right? But what we're talking about are two natures constituting one personal substance. So we have to differentiate between nature and substance. Okay? Now, the way some of the later church fathers tried to do it was the idea of body and soul. All analogies are going to fall short. There is no way to picture this. Okay, there are ways to illustrate it, but there are no ways to picture it. And by the way, it's the same with the Trinity. Most of the explanations that people use for the Trinity would lead to heresy if you really look at it. Let me just give you one, the egg. That leads to partialism because it's one egg, but those are only parts. It's an illustration, but it falls short. Same here. So the later fathers tried to use things like heat and iron, the body and soul, in order to explain this. Okay, why even bother with this? Jesus's human nature is vital. The fact that he experiences this temptation to avoid the cross as a human being is absolutely vital. Where we fail, where Adam failed, was to submit to God, to trust God. Jesus succeeds where Adam failed. He is the second Adam. The temptation he experienced in the garden was not play acting. He experiences all the dread and all the pain fully as a human being. Okay? Fully and completely as a human being. And it is important to Matthew because Jesus' humanity is vital to him being the Davidic king who can inherit the kingdom. If Jesus did not have a full human nature and did not succeed in not falling to temptation but trusting God, he would be unworthy for the Davidic throne. That's why you see the wilderness. Okay, we didn't go over this in Matthew because I started with you guys in Matthew later, but Jesus's wilderness is 40 days and 40 nights. Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness. Jesus is the ultimate Israel, the quintessential epitome of what Israel was supposed to be, her king. Where Israel fails in the wilderness, Jesus succeeds. This is another point of the same sort of thing being reiterated by Matthew. He is the legitimate king. He is the worthy king. And although J.R.R. Tolkien never intended allegory, as my daughter would point out, unfortunately, some of it slipped in because Aragorn faces the same temptation in the final battle with the temptation as far as being offered the power that the One Ring was supposed to offer. Now, I know it wasn't allegory and he intended it, but it happened. We'll go back to that illustration, Lindsay, because that becomes an interesting illustration. Lindsay just shared one, and I want to go back to it because there is a way of talking about this. Okay? Understand, Adam was supposed to be God's vice regent. The earth was given to men to inhabit, men, humanity. We were supposed to be the vice regents over this planet. If God cannot restore a physical kingdom on a physical earth to a son of Adam who is worthy and will rule righteously, then Satan essentially has never been fully defeated because he wrecked God's plan. By the Redeemer having a nature, being God fully and decisively counters Satan's intent to destroy oneness between God and humanity and God and his creation. God fully undoes what Satan did. And Jesus is the representative, the second Adam, and he is the greater than Moses. And by the way, Moses kind of fails with striking the rock too, while they're out there in the wilderness. Because remember, he never enters the land. So in the wilderness, Moses fails. Jesus succeeds. He succeeds where Adam failed. This is why our union in Christ is so absolutely important, because in Christ, the victory of the second Adam becomes our victory too. It is imputed to us, and we have access to that authority, that power, and that victory. Well, I just get all excited about union in Messiah and what it could mean for us. God undoes what Satan did. Okay? But Jesus also has to be our high priest. Because remember, thou art a priest according to Melchizedek. Psalm 110 is messianic. It's applied to him. By the way, a good counter for Mormons who say that Joseph Smith inherited the priesthood of Melchizedek. Hebrews makes it clear that Jesus possesses the Melchizedekian priesthood. God will not change his mind. It won't be given to another. Therefore, Joseph Smith never had the Melchizedekian priesthood, which I'm not ashamed to point out to Mormons. Here's Hebrews, and Hebrews destroys your understanding of this whole thing. To be a high priest, he's got to be able to sympathize with us. If he does not know what temptation feels like in a human nature, he cannot understand temptation experientially the way you and I face it. And temptation for us will always be to meet a need apart from God, to do it ourselves. I did it my way. Okay, autonomy. Complete autonomy from God is the essence of sin and the draw of temptation in one way or another. Jesus is facing this as a human being, and he goes to God for help. Now, I'm going to talk about an illustration that might be useful, okay? There's another reason here. There are things Michael Heisner says I like. I don't like everything. I disagree with him about the Trinity being pictured in the verse. He says the Trinity is not pictured in the verse, let us make God in our image. I disagree with him strongly there. However, I think he is right about the idea of a heavenly court and angelic beings because of verses like, do not you know that you will judge angels? Man and God ended up having a lack of oneness between them. It resulted in separation between God's terrestrial family, which is humankind, and God's celestial family, which would be him and the angels. And I'm not talking about the demons. I'm talking about the angels, okay? Demons being fallen angels. Now, watch what happens in Messiah, okay? And this is where this is really cool. Jesus is, now get this, this is like really hard for me to wrap my mind around. Jesus is in a glorified Davidic body. Okay, he still has a glorified body. I mean, he appeared to the disciples afterwards in a glorified body. I walked through walls. It did all sorts of cool stuff. I can't walk through walls. I get hurt when I try that. Jesus is forever united with humankind, and as the God-man, human nature is elevated in him. We have a representative who is over all powers and all principalities. In other words, we have a representative. We are represented in the heavenly council. Okay? Before God. We have a representative before God in that sort of kingly celestial court where God is king. And we have that representative. And so Jesus has authority over those fallen, wicked powers that are connected with the angelic world. And as such, that is important to us because we have a different position and we have representation. And I think that that's incredible. I think about that with prayer. I think about that with asking God to fulfill his purposes. Or seeking him, that I have a representative in the heavenly council, and I can ask him to do that kind of battle because of where he sits. Now, what about the divine side? Jesus was fully God. As God, he's going to experience hell. What is hell? Separation from God. I'm sorry, it says in Hebrews, he tasted death for everyone. How could he taste death for everyone? What does he yell out on the cross? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Eloi, Eloi, sabachthani in the Aramaic. Jesus experiences hell. Not hell like, I'm not talking about Hades here. I'm talking about what hell is all about. And notice the focus in Jesus' suffering in terms of hell is about separation from God. That exile and separation are the key motifs for me. Check those out in the scripture too. Whenever man sins, whenever he gets judged by God, there is often, I shouldn't say whenever, there is often an element of exile when God judges man. Look for it. What do we understand here? God enjoyed community within himself. When it says God is love, this is an interesting point to make to Muslims. Our scriptures say God is love. Whom did God love before the beginning of the world? Okay. There is a break of oneness in the Godhead at the cross. I don't even understand how that works. So someone like a Muslim says to you, okay, wait a minute. How could God experience separation in himself? That's illogical. Okay. He can't feel separation in himself. Now, Maimonides' rationalism wouldn't even allow for this. Remember the second article that we talked about where there is no unity like him. Okay? And he cannot be anything but unified. He is an absolute unity, and there is no unity like his. There is no disunity in him. Maimonidean rationalism wouldn't allow it. Muslims don't allow it. If he's God, he cannot be separate from himself. They would not allow for this. Let me give an illustration and a definition. And this is real important that we understand. God did not, in his essence, get disunified. Okay, it's not like milk where the cream comes to the top and the rest of the milk separates. And if you're younger, you don't even know what non-homogenized milk is. Okay? But milk, if it's not homogenized, will separate. It's not like that. It's not ontological. It's not in his essence. What he did experience was a sense of disconnectedness within himself. Now, Lindsay brought up the triangle. Oops. Okay, well. Okay, Lindsay brought up the three-dimensional triangle in a two-dimensional world. Okay. And then John Williams decided to go with a pyramid. The way I sometimes will talk about the Trinity is a loci is a center or center, loci, locus in math or loci in math. I will say that God has three loci of consciousness or is tri-personal in his oneness. Okay. And then I will define person in terms of center of consciousness, and nature is the qualities of the consciousness. Now, the way Brian Crawford put it is the who and the what. Okay. Person is the who. Wait a minute. Nature is the what. And so that's the way he put it. Okay. And then she went and said in a pyramid, sometimes you see a flat triangle if you're looking at just one of the sides. And so there's some real good geometry and analytical geometry going on here tonight. How could this happen, though? Can I come up with any illustration that helps me? Yeah, my foot falls asleep. Now, when my foot falls asleep, does it cease to exist? I mean, is it no longer ontologically a part of my body? Okay, no. I experience a lack of feeling in that foot, but it is still my leg or foot. It is still connected to me, but I lack any sort of experience of its connectedness. In other words, when my foot falls asleep, I sense or feel or have an experience of disconnectedness, but there is no actual disconnectedness that is going on. It is a loss of the sense of my foot. And although that illustration is not perfect, I think it is an illustration we can take by analogy from lesser to greater and kind of use. So I'd say to the Muslim, look, Jesus didn't cease to be God at the cross. What happened was the sense of his connectedness was not, he lost awareness of the sense of that connectedness. Now, it's not perfect. It's not phenomenal. But I think it falls within orthodoxy. Whoops. Sorry about that, Lindsay. Your pyramid comment decided to return. Maybe it's more of a boomerang than a pyramid. I don't know. Okay. Let's get some take-homes for us. Okay. With a final important point. This is why I am so big on maintaining human responsibility in tension to divine sovereignty. Look, if God is so sovereign, human beings don't make choices, then Jesus as a human being never, ever faced any real temptation or choice in the garden because God had already decreed the cross. I believe human beings do make choices. And there had to be an actual decision. His anguish is not over nothing. He really has to struggle with the decision to submit to the cross. So human beings make actual decisions. Now, if you want a good book, there's a book that was done by Labrie, by somebody who sat under Francis Schaeffer, called Being Human. It is back in print. I would suggest that. It deals with human experience from a biblical worldview in relationship to who God is and how we are made. It is an incredible book. I remember cutting my teeth on it. I can go back maybe tomorrow and put the ISBN or the link. It's not real expensive. It was really, really good because it deals with the nature of real human experience and what it's supposed to look like from a biblical point of view. And it discusses some of the imbalances in different areas. And so it's really good. But I will avoid a theology that eliminates the reality that human beings make decisions. And when I look at this whole thing of regeneration and God drawing us to himself, I look at it as enabled response. Okay, there's really human response, but it's enabled. And I don't get rid of one side or the other. Okay? And I view it as God enabling as we respond as opposed to the other way. Because Jesus really faces a decision here. And that's really what makes this so valuable, because Jesus, as the God-man, submits by a volitional act of his will to the Father. Okay, so let's talk about a take-home here as we start to run, and then we're going to go back through here because there's some really worthwhile stuff here. Maybe some stuff occurred before the analytical geometry. In Jesus, humanity was elevated and oneness with God. I'm loving that term oneness, okay, because it ties into atonement, at one-ment, and it got brought up during the marriage thing, and it just is a really cool concept, especially for me as a guy who's not really like picture relationship real well. That was really kind of good. Humanity becomes elevated and oneness with God becomes possible. Okay. Let's see. And there's some good things. Some people made some connections. I'm looking at a few other things. There were some comments about Hebrew, which I love when people are excited about. And again, I mentioned that possibility of coming to your church, meeting with your pastor and having lunch, doing house meetings, meeting over coffee. All of that stuff has become possible this year. Not seeing any big questions come up. That's okay. It just means that there weren't a lot. And someone was sharing the beginning of the Lord's Prayer. By the way, that's what that was. Avinu is our Father. Okay, Bishamayim is who is in heaven. The shin being added in order to represent the relative pronoun. Shemayim is heaven. Actually, it's plural, but it can be translated heaven. So, nice Hebrew, transliterated. Okay, I don't see anything else there. If I have a split second, I can try and go to Amazon real quick and pull up the URL for Being Human and see if I can get it for you. Great book. And often I get other things when I try to do this, because we now name so many things after so many things that it becomes hard to find anything. But let's see if I can find it. I may not. I'm getting some other things. I'm going to put the author's name in, one of the author's names. See if that narrows it down. Not real helpful. Okay. I will have to do it by ISBN and put it in the description. Wait a minute. I can go further with the title, The Nature of Human Experience. There it is, The Nature of Spiritual Experience, Being Human. I got it. I've got the page and the URL here. There's our ISBN. I don't know if it'll let me copy it. There's the ISBN. Copy. I'm putting it in right now. Paste. There's your ISBN for the book. And I can also share this. If I go like this, it's not big enough for you guys. There it is. I've got a URL for you. Copy it. And I'll put the URL in. An incredible book, very useful. I don't know if it'll do it. It's quite a URL. But that should act as a link. And there you go. Just by way of price, it's $20 unused and $16 used. So it's doable. Okay. Well, that about brings us to an end. Thank you for those who stuck by. There's another resource for you. So you could say tonight's resource is Being Human, the Nature of Spiritual Experience. Okay. I'm not understanding that comment. Could I put it in the description? Okay, I can put that in the description tomorrow. And go ahead and do that. I don't think I can access the video tonight because it'll process immediately afterwards. But I can go ahead and do that. And there's a resource for you. So if I had a book bag like vocab, that would be what I'd pull out of the book bag for tonight. All right. Oh, and Slam threw it in there too. Let me show that because her link might be better than mine. And there you go. And I probably can pull that from the comments tomorrow and put it in the description. So good book, challenging. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. It's great having you all here. Keep in mind that offer. Okay. In fact, I will go back to that banner real quick. Okay. Possibility to get together with you. Do some stuff in your area. So, and that would be great. Got to put it together. I have to be in charge of like piecing those meetings together, creating an itinerary, get that all over to the people who draw up the paperwork. So, and they do have final veto power if they think I'm going crazy. So, see you all next week, Lord willing. Bye.